What can business leadership learn from a professional artist? Turns out, a lot. At a time when we're being encouraged to think outside of the box, fine art is probably as far outside of the traditional business setting as you can get. Yet it seems that occasionally swapping Excel sheets for art supplies can give executives a totally new perspective on where their business is now, where they could be heading, and how to get there. I'm Jane Singer, and welcome to A Seat at the Table. Each week, I sit down with leading executives, entrepreneurs, authors, and innovators who share their experience, expertise, and insights about the future of business. This week, I had the opportunity to speak with Nora Herting, a pioneer of visual strategy. She's CEO and founder of ImageThink, a visual leadership company that has worked with clients ranging from pharmaceuticals like Pfizer and Johnson Johnson to tech giants including IBM and Google, as well as NASA and Toyota. In this episode, Nora talks about the power of visual thinking as a catalyst for personal and organizational change. She explains her unique visual approach that blends strategic thinking with creative expression. Before we get started, if you're looking to develop knitwear collections that are bursting with creativity, then Spin Expo is the place to go. It's the primary exhibition for yarns and knitwear. The fair is a rich resource featuring well-edited, high-quality collections, as well as cutting-edge technical innovation, not to mention outstanding trend information that cannot be found anywhere else. You can learn more at spinexpo.com. That's www.spinexpo.com. There's also a link in the show notes. And check out our website where you can find all of the previous episodes of A Seat at the Table, the show notes, news about our upcoming masterclass series, and lots of other useful information. You can find it at www.seat.fm. That's www.seat.fm. FM because it's a podcast. Now let's find out how Nora helps companies discover the game-changing benefits of thinking like an artist. Nora, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to have you on A Seat at the Table. I think that what you're doing is so interesting and it's so different than what we typically hear about.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Really excited to be here and talk with you more about visual leadership and what we do.
That's a topic that we don't really hear that much about. So when we think about business leadership, we typically think of people who have business backgrounds, and your background is art. So how has that given you a unique advantage in business leadership?
Yeah, good question. That's right. I have a master's in fine art in photography. And at the time I received it, I thought I'd be an artist and an academic, and got my first position, which was very hard to land, at a private university. And then pretty quickly realized that it was a little bit, this goal that I had pursued for 10 years was a little bit of a failure of imagination, and that I hadn't really challenged where I could use my skill set as an artist elsewhere. And fast forward a decade or so, ImageThink is a team of 15. We support Fortune 500 companies globally. I think we've worked in 27 countries. But what I find is, as a trained artist, that there is a certain mystique that the business world puts around creativity and innovation, that they know that it's something that is important and they want to cultivate it, but they're not exactly sure how to foster it. And so that is realizing that there's skills that we have innately as creative people that we could share with the business community was a pretty big light bulb. And then also the power of visuals for leaders to be able to align people, to inspire people, to story tell, has really been the fuel behind our company and the success we've had with clients.
That's so interesting because we're hearing more and more these days about the importance of telling a story, whether it's about your product, whether it's about a concept, to approach it from a storytelling point of view. So I think that the fact that you bring that up is really touching on something that's become increasingly valued. But what are some of the visual tools that you use when you're working with clients?
Yeah, great question. So there's a lot of different ways we work with clients, from place where the client is more passive and more active. If you think about a strategy session, or for instance, next week we're working with one of the big 5 consulting firms, and they're planning their 2022 strategy for this division. And we will be there first mapping out visually, helping facilitate the conversations about where they are right now. We're going to create a very complex visual map because I hear this from clients all the time. One part of the organization is working really hard. They don't recognize what the other person, like what else we're doing, and no one takes a step back and sees the big picture. So that's the first thing we're going to do is help create a visual map so they can see the lay of the land and what is rising up to them. Where are the opportunities? Where are the gaps in a picture that everyone can access? So helping put your arms around something that's really complicated and see a larger picture is one way where visuals can be really powerful for the group. And then as we move through the 3 days, we'll help them visualize their future strategy. And so when they leave, they'll actually literally be a picture and a roadmap of where they're going. And then that, Jane, is where the storytelling part really comes in, and it helps the leadership get out and really spread that message and get people on the same page and realizing where they're going into the future.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting approach, because too often I think people look only at the data side of things. And I think the numbers, of course, are important. You can't deny that. But the fact that you're leading people to look at it from a different point of view perhaps would shed light on things that they had overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that it's not without data, because a lot of it is what we do is we'll look at all that data and then figure out a way to simplify it so that it's more accessible to people. So oftentimes industries that we really are able to help are IT, are healthcare, are very data-driven, science-driven organizations, but they have so many data points that they're not able to sort of process it, or they're looking at it in a really linear way. For instance, if you think about PowerPoint, which is the business go-to for presenting information, it's one slide at a time. So you can only really look at a linear one data point or one idea at once, versus having a visual map or a visual picture where you can show interrelationships of things or show multiple pieces of information in relation to each other. And just being able to do that can really spur different realizations.
So it helps people connect the dots, so to speak.
Exactly.
Can you explain what your ImageThink method is? In other words, I know it's quite comprehensive, but if you were to just sum it up, how would you describe image?
Yeah, great. So I love this question. After, let's say, 10 or 12 years of helping clients in meetings with different objectives, we started to recognize a bit of a pattern that every sort of initiative or project, whether it was something small like launching a new product, or if it was a whole business transformation that was going to last a couple of years, followed the same sort of life cycle of an idea, if you will. We started to being visual people and recognizing patterns that those different stages of that project to different visual tools and different objectives that leaders would have it through the stages. So for example, we're talking about innovation, right? You start off and you might say, oh, we have a need to change, either because of outside forces like COVID, or because we're being mandated from inside, is the sort of scan phase. And there you want a lot of big thinking, and you want to pull in a lot of inspiration, a lot of data points, and think outside what you're doing right now. And then, of course, once you've arrived at that, there's a bunch of other touch points you have to go through before you get to execution. And a number of those, Jane, are really around people. After being in hundreds of meetings every year for about 10, I think it was about 10 years in, I stopped with my team and I said, let's map the different types of objectives that we see clients. And what we realized is a pattern emerged that maps very closely to a design thinking method, if you will, where it's a life cycle of an idea. And this applies whether it's a small project, maybe something that's launching for 1 quarter, or a massive business transformation. There's the same sort of stages that initiative needs to go through to be successful. So for example, the first stage is really that, hey, we need to change. Like, we need to come up with a new idea. We need to react to either something externally or internally differently. And that's the scan brainstorming phase, where you want to pull in a lot of data, a lot of inspiration. You do all the big thinking there. But of course, there's a number of stages that happen after that before it's successfully executed and received well by the customer or the market or whatnot. And a lot of those stages also involve engaging people and making sure the message resonates with them, that they understand the vision, that they know what they need to do. And so that goes back into sort of that storytelling that we were just talking about, Jane. So for us, we're able to see where a client is, understand what they need to do in terms of meeting their people, and then map sort of visual tools along with that to help carry that project forward.
I think that's really an exciting approach. Can you give a few examples of how this has been applied in specific companies?
Let's see, there's so many examples. For instance, one of my favorite ones is working with a pharmaceutical company, global company, that wanted to change their values, their company values. And I don't know about you, but I'm a little wary of those kind of things where you walk into a cafeteria, all these words like trust and respect up, and you think, oh, are those just window dressing? This company, they really wanted to make sure that this resonated with people. And they had a creative approach that was great to work with them on, where over a series of quarter, we brought in hundreds of global leaders, and they were asked to think about a story either in their workplace or personally that exemplified one of these values. And they sat at tables with 5 or 6 people, and they told each other their story. And as they were doing it, someone from ImageThink was sitting at the table with them and literally drew up a picture of that story. So what happened was, they were able to relate it to something that they had done. But then they took those stories back and they hung them in their offices. So when their direct reports would come in, they would look at this drawing and they would say, oh, that's interesting. What is that about? And that would give the leader an opportunity to tell the story about that value and why it was important to them and what it means for the company. So that's one of my favorite, because it's a really creative way to roll out something that could just feel like business speak to people, but made it really personal and gave them a visual to use. And I am always so excited. We did that project years ago. I'll still meet people from this organization that say, oh, wait, I have that drawing. I remember that. And what we also hear is when something like that happens and you get to see a visual of someone else's idea or story, it resonates so much more. It's more memorable, right? So for everyone hearing each other's story and seeing those visuals come to life, they were able to also feel a connection and remember those other stories about values. So that's just one example, but a really fun one and one close to my heart.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that when you see something drawn like that, you definitely connect to it on a different level than, as you were saying, when you see slogans or words. I mean, they have a value also, but I think that creating that story around it is it's more powerful, it's more engaging. Are there other ways that you've used this? You were talking about people who were trying to come up with new ideas or a new vision for example, for 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our favorites techniques is really called Bridge to the Future. So this is when you're past that scanning phase that I was telling you about, and you're starting to try to move into, okay, what do we need to do to make this happen? The first thing is to first really be real about where you are right now. And you can do this as an individual. I have a book called Draw Your Big Idea, right? So that takes all of these concepts that's worked for big businesses and puts it in the hands of individuals. So there's actually a prototype or a template that you can draw right on top of and draw your big idea. But first, it's to look around and say, what is the current state like? What's going well? What's not going well? What resources do I have? What's the state of affairs? And we will do an exercise and we will visualize that up for everybody. So there's a picture on one side of where they are. And that really helps because some people aren't aligned with that, right? You could have one role that's all rosy and going well and not understand that another part of the business has a lot of challenges. So there's a lot of value in level setting there. Now we have a picture where we are, and then we say, okay, we have this vision, right, into the future. What is that going to look like? What is that going to look like for us? What is that going to look like for the organization? What is that going to look like for other people? If you're doing this for yourself, people in your life, and you move over to the far side of the page and you visualize that future state. And what is that going to mean? And you really get concrete about that. So it's not just, oh, we're going to be leaders in our field, or we're going to hit X amount of revenue. Materially, what is that going to change day to day? And then what you have is this gap in the center, Jane, right? And so for us in this template, a lot of times we'll change up the metaphor, but let's say it's a big pit of water, right? You're on one side of a shore and you need to get to the other. All right, so what are we going to need to do to bridge where we are now to the future? But let's not forget that nothing, if it was that easy, we'd already be there. So we like to then make people think about the challenges. And in this example I'm telling you, and draw your big idea, we make the challenges sharp, because you should have fun with this, right? And the groups will really start to lean into that storytelling. One global organization, the sharks were the leadership team, and they drew that up there because the leaderships were the sharks. And so you have to also think about, we're going to have these obstacles, we're going to have these sharks or these big rocks. So what in our solution is going to help us traverse that? So then in the center, you really have this bridge, and that's where you start to get a little bit more concrete about what are the action steps, what are the initiatives, what resources do we need that we don't have right now, whether that's hiring more people or different skill set. And then at the end, when this is done, you can pull back and you have a map of where you're going to go. And we've done this for large and small organizations. Time and time again, people feel like there's a clarity around where they're going. There's an excitement from the people in the room, but then they're able, again, to that storytelling, to take this, roll it out and socialize it to the rest of the organization in a way that's really relatable and cuts down on a lot of complexity and makes it very clear about, let's lock arms and move forward.
I think that's really important where you talk about cutting down the complexity, because oftentimes good ideas get caught up in the complexity and therefore they almost become impossible to execute on. So I think that being able to simplify it so that everybody understands it and understands what's at the heart of the matter is so important. Now, when you look at it, how do you then take this, or maybe you don't at this stage, but how do you tie it in with the typical data or metrics that companies feel they need, and in many cases you do need?
Right. So sometimes that happens in that session, and sometimes it happens after that session. Leaders, if it's a really big strategy, a year-long strategy or whatnot, they realize that they're going to need to get more granular. Then it becomes clear that those things are going to be handed off to certain teams. So what are the metrics of success? If we have this roadmap, where do we need to be at mile marker 1? Where do we need to be at mile marker 5? And they're able to map those more granular data points against a bigger picture. And what's great about that is that way they're moving in the same direction, right? You don't have part of an organization that maybe is looking at one type of metric and another part of the organization looking at another, and they don't actually match up and support each other, because you first mapped out the larger direction. So the smaller pieces become easier to identify. And
so what you're doing is you're starting with the concept in a sense, and then you're working down from that to establish metrics by which to measure success or progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, here's an example of what can happen if you don't start that way. And I'm sure that you could think of examples too. We were working with the second largest telco company in Canada. So think about the Verizon of Canada. And their digital department had somewhere, they estimated, between 150 and 200 different projects they were working on. But no one could say for sure how many they had, because it was distributed across an entire team. And the CEO had went to them and said, what are you doing? How many of these things are supporting our strategic business goals? And they actually had no idea. In fact, they feared that some of them were redundant. Different teams were working on the same thing, or some teams are jumping too far ahead because you figure it's technology and there's interdependencies. So what we had to do was basically have a session where we created, like, on a 16 by 16 foot board, this big grid, and each team had to start to plot what it was that they were working on, kind of by topic, so that at the end of the day, they could see collectively what they were all doing. And they were able to recognize that a number of things that they were doing were redundant or were really low priority for the bigger strategic objectives of the organization. So there was a real kind of moment where they had to sort through their mess and reorganize and cut some projects down so that they were ultimately all working efficiently and supporting the organization. So that's an example of what can happen, right? If you don't have that higher level picture. But even that's not an impossible thing. We were able to help get them to have clarity and align around what really they needed to get done.
I think that's interesting to see how you were able to take so many bits and pieces and help them corral so that everybody was flying in formation, so to speak.
Yeah, I like that analogy too, the flying in formation. So you already get a visual around that. I'm thinking like, a lovely flock of birds. Maybe Canadian
exactly. I think, especially in a large organization, but even in small ones, you end up getting so many different bits and pieces that somebody starts this and someone else starts that. And then you end up with all these different things going on and nothing has been brought together cohesively. And you're right. For some people, seeing data and looking at Excel sheets, they can really start to see where things are going. But for other people, the approach that you're suggesting, which is a more visual, more artistic, really brings things into clarity, into alignment a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. I one time was in a workshop with a bunch of leaders just talking about this as a principle to apply, much like we are today. And one of the examples I put up was one of these sort of bridge to the future strategies. And the woman said, wait, that's actually my team. And we still have this. And I was a little shocked because this was a big technology company. And usually in technology, something that you're working on 2 years ago is completely obsolete at this point. And she said, no, you know what? Not at all, because I show this to every intern, every hire that we have, because even though we've achieved a number of these things, I'm able to show them where we've been already and still where we're going. So I actually physically have this mural in my office still, and we use it all the time, which was a great story. So it's not even just for the people in the moment. It also can be, you come into an organization and there's all this context that you don't know about what have we been working towards? Where were we? And so to hear that even new people coming in found this valuable so that they could understand where they're entering in this journey. So
I think that's important. It's interesting to see how it's being used at different levels of the organization. Typically, organizations in leadership tend to look for people who are numbers oriented, right? You think of, the leader is the one, the senior C-suite staff, or all the guys looking at the numbers. Now that you're introducing this method, the ImageThink method, which is more visual, do you think companies will start to give a little more attention to people who come from a more creative angle on things? Do you think those people will start to gain a little more recognition, a little more respect in within the company?
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
If you're a pet owner who wants real talk on training, behavior, and everyday life with animals, check out the Fresh Patch Podcast. Hosted by Drew and Gabe, we cover the wins, the challenges, and everything in between. So wherever you listen, search the Fresh Patch Podcast, where good pets get it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you think in interviewing all your guests, but I remember a study done years ago by IBM, probably 5 or 6 years ago, that creativity was named by something like 65% of global CEOs as a necessary trait for a leader. Now, that might not be creativity that looks like throwing pots or even creating strategic visuals like we do at ImageThink, but being able to solve problems in unique ways, see holistically, connect unrelated things. Those are all markers of creativity. So I do see, I think, a real value in a different kind of leadership skill, right? One that's around creativity, one that's around empathy and listening to people and seeing the bigger picture versus simply looking at the numbers. So I do, see that. And of course, we're lucky because we get to work with clients that embrace that thinking in a way. And from my experience, ImageThink has always had the privilege and, the fortune of getting to support some really interesting industries, a lot of big tech and a lot of healthcare and pharmaceutical industries. And thinking about what is common across those is IP, right? The intellectual property for Google of their algorithm or their AI, the molecules in drug research that Pfizer might own, right? That's their bread and butter. And so those companies really put a premium on innovative thinking and different thinking and recognizing that is around collaborating, getting the best kind of thinking out of a group. And so we have a long history of helping support clients that find that valuable and put a premium on that. But as time has gone on, we've also seen the finance industry come to us or nonprofits. And so I think there is, Jane, a shift or awareness of these other skill sets and how they're helpful for leaders and in business.
It's a good point that you make. I think increasingly companies are recognizing that you need a multi-dimensional leadership team, or at least multi-skilled, that typically what was the way maybe isn't the way any longer. And bringing in people like yourselves can bring a whole new point of view and uncover ideas and new solutions that people hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe it's a different generation of leaders and maybe more diversity in what that C-suite looks like has helped to push an appreciation of different skill sets.
How did you go from a career in art as a professional photographer and then as an art professor and then end up as a consultant on business leadership and problem solving to Fortune 500 companies?
Yeah. Do you want the short version or the long version?
I'm up for either.
Okay. As I mentioned, that I had a master's in fine art and I was teaching at a university and my family was working class. I was first generation to college. So the steady paycheck and the health insurance that was represented by being a college professor seemed, like a sort of a necessary thing. And I worked really hard. I got this position. I was 26, 27, and realized, hey, maybe this isn't for me. Left that, and I was going to move to New York with no job. And before I did, I went out to dinner with my mom. We went to this diner and she said, we're eating our dinner. Hey, so when you get to New York, are you going to work at an art firm? Now, at first I was like, trying not to laugh. I was like, an art firm, Mom? She said, yeah, an art firm where artists all are employed by a company and they go to an office and they make art for other business. And I must have just looked confused because she said, Nora, like a law firm, but for artists, an art firm. And then by that point, she was so earnest about it that the smile was off of my face. And I looked at her and I said, oh, that doesn't exist. And she got real quiet and this look of kind of terror went over her face. And she said, well, it doesn't. Like, no. Then Nora, what are you going to do? And I felt terrible because I thought, okay, I have 2 degrees and my mother is afraid that I'm going to starve and I really don't have an answer for her. So I moved to New York and I fell in with a group at Capgemini, which is a global consulting firm. And they had what we would all call now like design thinking innovation hubs. But this was the early 2000s and no one really used that term at all. In fact, everybody else, I think, just thought we were like this really weird division where they would bring their biggest projects through and we design and run these 3-day workshops. And that is where I learned the skill of graphic recording, which is what we rely on at ImageThink, the translation of visuals into words into pictures and visuals in real time. And it was a lot of fun doing it. And eventually I made my own website, The Business Partner, and our first client was NASA, which was fantastic. And fast forward maybe 6-7 years later, and I walk into our company office in Brooklyn and I look around and I see all of these people with art degrees working to create visuals for companies. And Mom was right. I made the art firm. So that is, That's the long version, Jade.
Yeah, wow. Congrats. It's it's really interesting because you don't think about these things. And I think most people think the way your mother thought. And that is on a very linear path that you go to school, you get a certain degree, you then get an entry level job in something related to that degree, and you move up from there. And I think that in a sense, in the last probably more 20 years, maybe, yeah, I wouldn't say much earlier than that, we've really seen such an explosion of people doing completely different things, just taking their skills and turning them on their head and trying to see how could I use this, but in a totally different way, in an unexpected.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was a child of the 80s, and the ideas where you get that degree and you go to college and then there's a job waiting for you afterwards. Well, that was a shock, right? Of course, I did get an art degree, so I set myself up for that. But then, yeah, there was one linear path that was uninspired to me, or these other ways of moving through the world. And so it is much more exciting. But then I think each person has to act as their own entrepreneur, their own business person, their own sort of career coach. And you had asked earlier, what kind of skills did I pick up as a trained artist that helped me in business? And from the business owner side, that I think was tremendously helpful, because as an artist, you have to wear many hats, right? You're the maker, you're the marketer, you're your own administrator. You get pretty much nothing but rejection, right? So you also have to be really tenacious and real driven. And most artists I know have a tremendous discipline about their work and what they need to do. And so it was almost a surprise that I was able to move into business, but then I realized that I had honed a lot of these skills as an artist, but there's very little crossover. I think we have this idea in society, those are two very separate domains. And what I strive to do at ImageThink in a way is to overlap those. So both business people see the benefit, even of their own skill set in that way in business. And the artists that end up becoming ImageThink employees see that they have a skill set that's really valued by business.
I think that's really it's such a fantastic opportunity for people, because like you had said, people tend to be siloed before that.
And breaking those down, I think across a lot of industries is just going to benefit all of us tremendously.
Absolutely. You only really appreciate it when you've been involved in something where you've participated and seen how it works. Because as much as you can try to conceptualize it, you really feel the full power of it when you have your hands in the clay, so to speak. So I think that so many people who are hearing what you've had to share would want to connect with you. Where can people find you? Do you have a URL?
Great, sure. So you can find out more about ImageThink. We have a lot of resources, videos, some great books around visual thinking on there at imagethink.net. If you want to continue chatting with me, happy to connect with you on LinkedIn. I'm just under Nora Herting, my first and last name.
Okay, that sounds great. And I understand you have a new book that's about to be published.
It's out. Draw Your Big Idea. So what it is, it's 110 visual exercises, a number of them related to conversations we just had today, Jane. But again, rather than in a business context, it's meant for individuals. So it'll help you move through that entire phase I talked about, using creative prompts and pictures to help you visualize your ideas and where you want to go.
Wow, that's wonderful. And that's available, I suppose, on Amazon.
Definitely on Amazon. Chronicle is our publisher, so you could also pick it up at some local bookstores as well.
Okay. Nora, thank you so much. I've learned a tremendous amount talking with you, and it's so inspiring to hear this point of view that is out of the box and yet practical. It's out of the box, but it's not so far out of the box. You can see how you can really bring a lot of the methods that you've mentioned into a corporate setting, or even on a personal basis, and really rethink where you're going.
Yeah, absolutely, Jane. It's been so fun to talk to you. Thank you for giving me a seat at your table.
Oh, thank you. And you're always welcome back.
If you enjoyed this episode of A Seat at the Table, join me each week when I sit down with leading executives, entrepreneurs, educators, and authors who share their insights, experiences, and vision for the future of business. And make sure you visit Spin Expo. From trend information to technical innovation, Spin Expo is the primary exhibition for yarns and knitwear. The fair provides well-edited forums featuring high-quality products that are bursting with creativity. To learn more, go to spinexpo.com. That's www.spinexpo.com. You can also find a link in the show notes for this episode. Before you go, if you're looking for a concise view of key shifts, opportunities, and risks in global sourcing, then check out the current situation in sourcing. You'll find a link in the show notes. And don't forget to check out our podcast website, where you can find all of the previous episodes of A Seat at the Table, the show notes, news about our upcoming masterclass series, and lots of other useful information. You can find it at seat.fm. That's www.seat.fm. FM because it's a podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in the next podcast episode.